A bloody war rages on America's streets, fought with secret code.
Capone and his outfit are sending tens of thousands of messages each year.
Cracking the mob's codes is the job of just one woman.
If we hadn't found these code messages, we might never have solved the case.
Her work will help bring down Al Capone.
She is the linchpin in this fight against mob violence in America.
Save countless lives.
I am sitting here speaking to you because she may have saved that ship.
And even stop a Nazi invasion of America.
Information received that Germany plans direct attack on Panama Canal with German planes.
Her job now is listening out for spies.
These are the codes that changed our world. Bizarre markings, random letters, and numbers. Words that make no sense. But cracking them unlocks military secrets, decodes ancient civilizations, and reveals enemies in our midst. Now we uncover how they were decoded, the genius minds that broke them, and the secrets they revealed. On January 17th, 1920, after decades of campaigning from religious and political groups,
alcohol is hindering the coming of world peace because it is befuddling the thinking of humanity.
America goes dry. The National Prohibition Act heralds a new era of sobriety in the U.S.
Alcohol production across America shuts down. Breweries, saloons, restaurants, anywhere and anywhere that you could normally get a drink, you just can't do it anymore.
Distributing or selling alcohol is illegal, but drinking it isn't.
Anytime you make something illegal that's in high demand, criminals are going to step in and take control of that. That is going to put a lot of money in the pockets of some very, very dangerous people.
To quench America's thirst, street gangs begin to organize themselves into structured criminal mobs.
Many of these gangs became very, very powerful precisely because people still wanted to drink.
They're led by elaborately named mobsters, Lucky Luciano, Bugs Moran, and Machine Gun Kelly. But the most notorious mobster of all is Al Scarface Capone.
Al Capone is going to build a criminal empire that spans the country. Tens of thousands of speakeasies. The profits of this enterprise are just incredible. He's making about $100 million a year. In modern terms, that would be $1 billion a year.
Like all criminal empires, Capone's is built on the bodies of his enemies.
You don't become the mobster of all mobsters by being a nice guy. He's going to have gangs of gunmen taking out his rivals, bombing establishments that refuse to pay their protection money or buy his product. They'll show up and just unleash a hail of machine gun fire into the guy's car in the middle of a street in the middle of the day.
By 1926, more than 12,000 murders are taking place every year across America. And the homicide rate in large cities soars by 78% during Prohibition. America is at war. And this war is being waged with one weapon above all others: secret code.
Capone and his outfit are sending tens of thousands of messages each year. It's a level of sophisticated encryption that has never been seen before outside of military conflict.
These coded messages allow the mobsters selling liquor to communicate with the smugglers supplying it.
And these codes and ciphers are changing constantly to keep the police on their toes.
To win the war against the mob, law enforcement must crack the codes.
If you can break the code, if you can figure out how your opponent is communicating, you have a vital piece of information that allow you to get the upper hand.
But from the get-go, it's the mobsters who have the upper hand. Because not only is this war being fought with secret codes, the front line is far from the reach of the police. At sea, the illegal liquor fueling the bloodshed is being brought into the U.S. by boat, from Canada and Mexico via the West Coast, and the French and British territories and Cuba off the East Coast.
What you have is a system where freighters will pick up large amounts of alcohol in foreign port, and then they'll anchor in international waters where the Coast Guard cannot legally seize them. You have motherships the size of baseball fields that can hold 100,000 crates of liquor worth, in today's terms, $8 million.
High-speed contact boats, manned by so-called rum runners, meet the motherships and run the liquor back to shore.
Some of them are even armored to protect them. This has become just an incredible undertaking.
America's main line of defense against the illegal smuggling is the U.S. Coast Guard. But it's no match for the mobsters.
The US Coast Guard had a problem: ill-equipped, underfunded, and not paid very well.
Rum runners were speedy, were well armed, were well staffed, and could outrun, outgun, outman the Coast Guard.
It doesn't have enough ships, it doesn't have enough men, it just doesn't have anywhere near the power to make a real dent in this massive, well-funded, well-organized criminal enterprise.
But it's not just speed and manpower that helps this vast illegal enterprise stay one step ahead of the law. It's coded messages sent via radio using Morse code.
There's a huge amount of alcohol coming with boats and ships, and the only way for them to rendezvous is to communicate with each other. They communicate by radio. You have to make sure that those messages are so scrambled that even once you got the Morse code and you've written down the letters, you don't know what this thing is supposed to be saying. And so the gangsters are paying for great cryptography, for ciphers and codes that no one can break. You have to break the codes to stop them.
This level of sophisticated encryption is far beyond the capabilities of the underfunded U.S. Coast Guard.
The Coast Guard intelligence section was literally one guy, and he was not a code breaker.
The Coast Guard doesn't stand a chance. It needs another weapon.
Enter the woman who will take on the might of the mob, armed with nothing more than pencil and paper. Mother of two, Elizabeth Friedman.
To all appearances, as far as anyone can tell, she's just nice Mrs. Friedman who's working from home, who has her small children, and yet she will be the linchpin in this fight against mob violence in America.
After graduating with a degree in English literature in 1915, a chance meeting with eccentric millionaire George Fabian propels Elizabeth into a career as a codebreaker.
George Fabian is a man who's made a lot of money. His family has had a lot of money. And he decides he's going to run his own think tank.
Fabian had established a private research center outside Chicago called Riverbank to investigate his eclectic range of interests.
He has a lot of bright young people doing research in topics that he's interested in. And one of the topics is this idea that there are codes in Shakespeare, that Shakespeare really didn't write his own plays.
Instead, Fabian believes they were written by Tudor philosopher and scientist Sir Francis Bacon.
Bacon put these codes into the writing that would tell people who were smart enough to find them that he was the one who had written the Shakespeare plays.
And so, the 23-year-old English literature graduate finds herself plowing through letter by painstaking letter the entire works of Shakespeare, despite knowing nothing about codes or code breaking.
When I graduated from college, I was totally unaware that there was such a thing as codes and ciphers, not even to call it by its scientific name, cryptography and cryptanalysis.
Despite her lack of formal training, Elizabeth soon shows a natural ability for analyzing patterns in language. But she rapidly realizes the hidden codes in Shakespeare's texts are just a figment of Fabian's imagination.
She was afraid to tell her boss because she figured he'd probably fire her. Instead, she tells another employee, and that's William Friedman. He's a young scientist who's there, and he's intrigued by this. He's also very intrigued by Elizabeth.
On May 21st, 1917, Elizabeth marries William Friedman. But the celebrations are brief. A month earlier, America had entered World War I. Now the young couple is called upon to crack Germany's coded communications.
Elizabeth and William Friedman find themselves cracking messages for the War Department, the Navy. They're responsible for a huge number of messages. They're coming in by the sackful.
Messages were sent by as rapid a means as possible to Riverbank, and were usually deciphered on their way back to Washington within 2 hours.
When the war ends in 1918, Elizabeth looks set for a life as a homemaker and mother. But there's another war brewing. The war against the rum runners, bootleggers, and mobsters. And by 1925, 5 years after the Prohibition Act, it's a war the U.S. Coast Guard is losing.
The Coast Guard had thousands of messages backlogged, and they didn't know what to do with them because they couldn't pull the information out of them that they needed.
William Friedman is still working as a codebreaker for the U.S. Army. So the Coast Guard turns to his wife, Elizabeth.
When the Coast Guard comes looking for Elizabeth, she is thinking about a very modern concept, work-life balance. She's thinking that she's also a young mother. She says, can she work on these messages from home?
This, of course, was absolutely unheard of in the mid-1920s. No one worked from home. Certainly not a woman saying, I will do this, but only on the proviso I can work from home.
And they decide, yes, she can. They really need a code breaker. She can set the conditions.
Elizabeth's brief is simple. Decipher the mobsters' coded radio messages. This should enable the Coast Guard to intercept the rum runners' boats, stop the illegal liquor from being brought ashore, and provide a paper trail back to the mob bosses that will help bring them to justice. But there's a problem. A letter or phone call can be traced from sender to recipient. But because these messages are broadcast over the airwaves, it's almost impossible to pinpoint who's writing and who's receiving them. But that's exactly what Elizabeth needs to do in order to beat the mobsters.
What makes things especially difficult is you don't know who this message is intended for. It could be anyone just plucking those transmissions out of the air.
This makes radio the perfect medium for sending secret information. This is a recording of what's become known as a numbers station. Since the end of World War I, people have been tuning into dozens of mysterious radio stations, broadcasting on shortwave frequencies around the world.
Number stations are a very odd phenomenon. Most typically, they involve a little bit of music or tone, followed by a voice, often a sort of unnerving woman's voice, just reading off a string of numbers.
The meaning of these bizarre broadcasts is a mystery, as are the organizations or individuals behind them. Many people believe they're related to espionage, allowing government intelligence agencies to send messages to their agents in the field without revealing their location. Back in 1925, broadcasting to anyone and everyone in secret code, the mobsters operate safe in the knowledge their communications can't be used to trace them or their suppliers. This makes the task facing Elizabeth even tougher.
So there's not just the code breaking, there's also the analysis that goes with it. Is this from the Atlantic? Is this from the Pacific? Is it the same ship? Is it different ships? Where are these radio stations? And so there's the whole problem of locating where these messages are coming from.
Against these seemingly impossible odds, Elizabeth sets to work, drawing on the skills learned during World War I to plow through the mountain of intercepted messages.
When Elizabeth gets into this project, she realizes the enormity of what she has facing her here. And keep in mind, there are no computers. She's working with pencil and paper and her own experience breaking code.
What she's looking at usually is a jumble of letters. And then you've got to figure out, what do those letters mean?
The messages have been encrypted using multiple different codes and ciphers.
One of the things they might be using would be something called a monoalphabetic substitution cipher.
In this basic and widely known cipher, A might become B, B, C, and so on. The writer swaps each plain text letter for the letter one place ahead in the alphabet.
But what if A equals X, and B equals D, and C equals R? There are many other things they can do with ciphers. There are other things they can do with codes. And then they can also combine these in layers, and that makes it much more difficult to crack.
For example, faced with the letters MYHGC, Elizabeth would look for a pattern. Shifting the letters back 4 places might produce a block of letters that corresponds to a number in a commercial telegraph codebook.
Legitimate companies used code books because telegrams and cables are really expensive. The more you can boil your message down, the cheaper it will be.
The number itself means nothing, so Elizabeth would have to dig deeper, adding and subtracting numbers, until she finds a match in a different codebook, which finally gives her the solution.
She had such a talent for finding patterns in all of these numbers and letters jumbled together that it enabled her to get her foot in the door with codes much more quickly than others were getting a foot in the door. And so we have her knowledge, we have her experience, and we have her talent.
But once Elizabeth has cracked the code in one message, she has to do it all again for the next.
The whole system might be different, so what a Y is in one message doesn't tell you what a Y is in the next one.
Despite this seemingly impossible task, in her first 2 months, Elizabeth solves 2 years' worth of backlogged messages. This allows her to begin connecting the bosses, the boats, their routines and routes.
She is finding the names of the motherships, the names of the small speedy boats, and it enables the United States government to access the records for those ships and open up this whole huge enterprise.
We could actually graph where the ships were by the code they were using, so that we could almost draw a map of where these ships were at a given time.
In response, the mobsters raise their game.
Month on month, Elizabeth is watching these codes and ciphers from the rum runners getting harder and harder.
Within just a few years of the Prohibition Act, the codes are as complex as those Elizabeth faced during World War I. Codes composed by the mighty German military machine.
That kind of level of code breaking is what rum runners are capable of now, and she's just one woman who is trying to oppose all of this.
Against all the odds, between 1928 and 1930, Elizabeth Friedman cracks over 10,000 of the rum runners' coded messages. She smashes smuggling rings in the Gulf of Mexico, the Pacific Coast, and the eastern seaboard, all while working alone and raising 2 young children.
As the codes get more and more difficult, Elizabeth is forced to get better and better, and she does.
Then, in the spring of 1929, something happens that will test Elizabeth's skills to the limit. She's called in to help when a confrontation at sea escalates into an international diplomatic crisis. One that threatens to undermine America's global reputation and cost the country millions.
The I'm Alone is registered as a Canadian vessel, and that's important because in Canada, there is no prohibition.
In reality, the I'm Alone belongs to rum runner Dan Hogan. Hogan is not from Canada. He operates out of Louisiana, where he's known to locals as the Capone of the bayous. He's head of a rum-running syndicate that's smuggling at least $15 million worth of illegal liquor every year.
The I'm Alone would load up on liquor in Belize, and then it would transport it to just outside U.S. territorial waters and wait there while the smaller ships came and picked up the cargo.
The captain of the I'm Alone says that if you try to board and inspect my cargo, we'll try and kill you. The Coast Guard opens fire, and they sink the I'm Alone.
But instead of being a much-needed win for the beleaguered U.S. Coast Guard, it's a disaster.
Gunning down a vessel in international waters is an act of great violence that's going to have legal consequences.
The sinking of the I'm Alone is seen as a violation of international maritime law, an illegal act of aggression against Canada, and as Canada is part of the British Commonwealth, against Britain.
To the rest of the world, it looks like the Coast Guard may have committed an act of war.
To avert a damaging international crisis, the U.S. authorities need Elizabeth to prove the ship was smuggling alcohol and that its owners are Americans.
Any physical evidence that I'm Alone is a notorious rum runner is at the bottom of the Atlantic. But there is one hope.
Elizabeth focuses on a cache of intercepted telegrams that she suspects are linked to the I'm Alone. The messages are a random jumble of letters. But Elizabeth thinks she's seen these combinations before in one of the many commercially available code books.
The I'm Alone is depending partly on a business code book that was very well known.
Using this, Elizabeth is able to decrypt much of the message's content. The string of random letters becomes a series of numbers and 5-letter words.
She can see certain things are being bought and sold, certain things that look a lot like they're alcohol. But there are certain words in these cables that she's not able to read. They aren't in any business code book.
So she begins to think that they are a privately derived code talking about specific objects. She's very frustrated because they seem unbreakable. Until she knows what the objects are, there's no case to prosecute here.
But then, Elizabeth has a light bulb moment. Working with a New Orleans customs agent, she compares the coded messages with official cargo manifests from the port in Belize, where the I Malone collected its cargo.
She's able to look and see, for instance, that a cable will say they're requesting 1,700 of this code word, and she'll see that on that date, the I Malone loaded 1,700 bottles of a certain kind of whiskey. And each time, the amounts that are in the cables are matching with what the I Malone has taken on.
This proves the 5-letter words are all types of alcohol.
Now that Elizabeth Friedman has cracked the code, can translate the messages, and those prove beyond the shadow of a doubt that the I Malone was carrying liquor, and lots of it, 3,000 cases, worth roughly $1 million in today's terms.
But the U.S. government needs something bigger to justify the Coast Guard's aggressive and potentially illegal actions. Who owns the boat? And are they Canadian or American?
The messages that were sent from Belize were sent by telegram. And this becomes a very useful thing because U.S. law enables the Coast Guard to subpoena the records from the telegraph company and be able to see who the sender and the recipient are.
This reveals the cables were sent to a Joseph H. Ferran at the Western Union office of Manhattan's exclusive Hotel McAlpin. U.S. Treasury agents visit the hotel and discover Joseph H. Ferran is in fact none other than the Capone of the Bayous, Dan Hogan.
What's important for the United States case is that Dan Hogan is not Canadian, he's American. And by all the evidence that has turned up, is the owner of the I Malone.
Thanks to Elizabeth Friedman, the Canadian government's claim is denied. An international crisis is averted. And Hogan ends up spending 6 years in prison for rum running.
The messages were really the basis. They were the solid rock of the I Malone case. And if we hadn't found these code messages, we might never have solved the I Malone case.
It's a triumph for Elizabeth. But she isn't done with the mob.
Chicago, for him, prohibition, it's basically a license to print money. But the heart of this business enterprise is not just bullets and bombs. It's also codes.
Now, The authorities, with the help of Elizabeth Friedman, plan to turn the mob's codes against them. In April 1931, federal agents raid Conexco's New Orleans headquarters and make multiple arrests. Among these are several of Capone's lieutenants from his Chicago outfit. And they seize hundreds of encrypted messages that Elizabeth must decode to prove the mobster's guilt. But the codes are exceptionally complex, even for a cryptanalyst of Elizabeth's caliber.
They would use different codes simultaneously to confuse the issue. They never used a code more than 6 months.
And each message is made up of multiple layers of ciphers and codes.
First, you would take your message, and then you would look up in the code book each word or phrase, and you would change your message to reflect all of the different code words.
A second code book might then be used to convert the numbers back into letters.
Once you had your code word, you would put them into a cipher. So letter by letter, you would switch and swap them out.
After adding 2 layers of code and 1 cipher, the message is converted to Morse code and transmitted via radio. Luckily for Friedman, some of these messages include words that aren't in the code books and have only been encrypted using the penultimate stage of the process, the substitution cipher.
Leaving out that middle part creates a place where Elizabeth can get her foot in the door. She's able to figure out what cipher they're using at the end and be able to work her way backward through the message.
Two years after the raid on Conexco, Elizabeth is called to give evidence at the trial of the mob kingpins. Now her life is in danger.
The organized crime bosses did not have any problem at all with having people disappear. And if taking out Elizabeth would stop the case, they weren't beyond that. So she's put herself into a dangerous situation by decoding these messages.
The Conexco trial takes place in New Orleans, and it's the single biggest trial in the Prohibition era. The state versus the largest and most powerful smuggling network in the world.
This is, in many ways, a trial of the century. It has cost $500,000, a huge sum in the teeth of the Depression. It's covered by reporters from all over. Everybody's watching that witness stand when Elizabeth comes to tell them what she's seen.
On one side, 23 of the most dangerous men in the country, represented by some of America's most highly paid lawyers, including Al Capone's own personal lawyer.
Up in the dock, you have very dangerous criminals, and they have no trouble dealing with anybody who's opposing them. And here's Elizabeth coming up into the witness stand to testify against them without any hesitation. She doesn't even see it really as a matter of courage, just as something that this is what you have to do. It's part of the job.
The suburban housewife and master cryptologist is the prosecution's star witness.
Although she was rather a small person, only about 5'2", she was a powerful witness.
Elizabeth's job is to connect the criminal bosses with the operation of the smuggling vessels.
The important thing is you've got to prove that they're working together, that there's a conspiracy here. The way that they work together was through their encrypted radio messages. So they need Elizabeth to show how she decrypted this and how they show the connections.
As Elizabeth begins her opening testimony, the defense continually interrupts, questioning her credibility.
They objected to Elizabeth being brought forward as an expert. They objected to the idea that there is a science to code breaking. And they call Elizabeth incompetent, irrelevant, and immaterial.
The defense argues Elizabeth's solutions to the coded messages are simply personal interpretation rather than fact.
She got pushed so hard on this point that she finally turned and said, "Your Honor, is there a blackboard available to the court?"
Standing beside the chalkboard, Elizabeth unleashes a meticulous and devastating rebuttal. She writes a seemingly random collection of letters. Then she substitutes those letters for letters 2 places earlier in the alphabet. For example, Q becomes O, N becomes L, until the random letters become the name of a popular brand of liquor.
The court can see that, yes, there's a pattern here. This really is a science. She's not making it up. She knows exactly what she's doing.
Friedman goes on to coolly unpick the gang's coded messages, revealing the connections between the boats, booze, and bosses.
The messages that Elizabeth is able to decrypt for Connexco are showing what all the parts of the system are and how they're connected to the land-based operation. They really are a record, kind of day-by-day, message by message of how this entire network is functioning.
Over the United States government.
She fought the mob and made their lives hell. But now, 8 years after Elizabeth took the stand, America needs her brilliant mind more than ever. In the battle against an even deadlier adversary, the Nazis.
The world is on the verge of a war. Everybody can see this and sense it. And her job now is listening out for spies.
Between 1940 and 1945, Elizabeth, assisted by a team of just 3 other codebreakers, cracks 4,000 coded messages sent by Nazi spies, including a network operating straight out of New York City.
A spy trap was set. Walking into this trap is Colonel Fritz Duquesne, a leader of the spy ring and a professional German spy.
What the spies don't know is that the FBI is watching.
A concealed camera in the next office took these incriminating pictures.
And Elizabeth is listening.
These spies had a radio station on Long Island, which, unknown to them, was operated by an FBI agent.
She decrypts hundreds of the spies' messages. This, plus the surveillance, is all the evidence the FBI needs. In 1942, the Nazi spies are sentenced to a combined total of 300 years in prison. It is the largest espionage case in the history of the United States. But it's just the tip of the iceberg. As World War II rages in Europe, Nazi spies in both North and South America keep sending coded messages to their masters in Berlin. And the stakes keep getting higher.
Some of the most important information that they're supplying is about Allied shipping that's going from South America up into the North Atlantic and across to supply Britain.
Guided by the spies' encrypted messages, Nazi submarines hunt the supply ships that keep Britain armed and fed. If this lifeline is cut, the Nazis will take a critical step closer to victory. Elizabeth and her team crack thousands of these messages, working around the clock. So Allied ships can be forewarned about impending U-boat patrols. One of those ships is the Queen Mary.
In the fall of 1942, the Queen Mary is a troop ship carrying troops from New York City to Scotland to be trained in Great Britain.
For months, Nazi spies have been sending details of the ship's Atlantic crossings. But Elizabeth decodes the messages, allowing the Queen Mary to change course and dodge the U-boats.
She really, honestly changed the face of the war. From a personal note, I am sitting here speaking to you because she may have saved that ship. One of the units that's on the Queen Mary is the 29th Infantry Division. 29th Infantry Division is the unit that hits Omaha Beach on D-Day and is involved in the Battle of the Bulge. My father was part of the 29th, and he sailed in September of '42 on the Queen Mary from New York Harbor. So Elizabeth could have saved the war by saving this ship. She certainly provided the life of myself and my siblings.
But at the Coast Guard headquarters in Washington, D.C., despite catching dozens of spies, saving thousands of lives, and helping to win the Battle of the Atlantic, Elizabeth is demoted.
The Navy took over the Coast Guard, and the Navy had a policy that neither a civilian nor a woman could lead an office. So she was basically demoted, and someone without the knowledge of code breaking that she had was put in charge.
Elizabeth is undeterred because she's fighting the biggest, most important battle of her life. A battle for the survival of America itself.
A network of German airlines had spread as far north as Colombia. A neighboring and friendly continent could become an armed menace.
It was a real worry that South American countries might end up becoming allied to Germany. Germany could then put troops and planes in South America, which would put them in reach of first the Panama Canal and then to the United States itself.
Nazi spies based in South America are sending hundreds of coded messages to Berlin every month. But one name appears over and over again. Sargo.
Elizabeth doesn't know who this man is, but she can tell he's important. And she's right.
Sargo is the code name of Johannes Becker, the Nazis' main agent in South America.
Becker is an SS man. He's one of Himmler's hand-picked shock troops.
From his base in Argentina, Becker travels widely across South America, directing a network of at least 250 agents and working to incite a revolution.
The spies want to turn each nation in South America so that it's allied to the Nazis. They are also interested in staging warfare against the United States directly.
Elizabeth knows exactly what's happening because she's cracked the code Sargo is using. With every message she decodes, she can see the danger unfolding. But she's powerless to stop it.
The problem that Elizabeth has, that many code breakers face, is that they know what's going on, but in order to act on it, they might end up inadvertently revealing that they can read the messages. If the Germans change their codes and the Allies are locked out, then the Allies could well lose the war.
All Elizabeth can do is decode the messages and wait. until the autumn of 1943, when Sargo finally slips up.
Elizabeth finds out that Sargo is helping to arrange for one of his key people to travel over to Germany as an envoy from the Argentinian government.
This envoy will meet Himmler, one of the Nazi regime's most powerful men, to ask for weapons and negotiate a secret alliance between Argentina and Nazi Germany.
What nobody knows is how he's traveling, exactly when he's going to get there. If they can find out what ship it is, they can nab him.
Once again, it's Elizabeth and her team who provide the breakthrough. They decode the messages to identify the ship, allowing Sargo's agent to be arrested when the ship stops to refuel in British-ruled Trinidad. Now the Allies can blame the agent for divulging information under interrogation, without revealing Sargo's codes have been cracked.
They are then able to go to Argentina and say, get rid of your Nazi spies. We have proof one of the spies has talked. And if you don't get rid of any official relationship that you have with Nazi Germany, then the United States will make sure you suffer the consequences.
Publicly shamed, in January 1944, Argentina officially severs all relations with Germany and Japan. And the Nazis lose their last chance of finding a foothold in South America.
From that point onward, Sargo and all of the people he's recruited are on the run. Elizabeth has helped to successfully destroy the most effective opposition in South America.
Without Elizabeth Friedman's code-breaking skills, honed in World War I and the fight against the mob, America may have been fatally compromised by Nazi spies. The Battle of the Atlantic might have been lost, and the Nazis might even have launched an offensive on the United States from South America.
I think it's amazing to note that with a small team of code breakers, armed with literally pencils and paper, no computers here, no fancy technology, they potentially helped win the war. And I think that you can honestly say that in this case, the pencil is mightier than the sword.
But in the decades after the war, Elizabeth Friedman's contribution to the Allied victory is all but forgotten.
We have guarded the secrets, have given the Army and Navy its striking force in the field.
J. Edgar Hoover would always claim that decryptions that were done by Elizabeth had been done by the FBI. It wasn't true, but Elizabeth was under the terms of the Espionage Act.
Elizabeth was sworn to secrecy for life.
She could not say, I did that work. She had to keep quiet. She also had a boss. At the end of the war, he received 6 different medals and honors. Elizabeth got none.
Elizabeth Friedman was a true 20th century hero. She served her country through not 2, but 3 wars. Both world wars and the war against the mob. Now, 2 decades after her death, aged 88, Elizabeth is finally receiving recognition for her brilliance and bravery. In 1999, she was inducted to the National Security Agency's Hall of Honor. And in July 2020, the U.S. Coast Guard announced it was naming a new ship in honor of Elizabeth Friedman.
Elizabeth broke glass ceilings before we even knew what glass ceilings were. She invented the science of cryptography, and she invented it as she went along. There was no instruction book. She wrote the instruction book. She didn't look for the attention, but I think that she would be glad to know that the work and the accomplishments could be inspiring to young women today who think that the cards are stacked against them, because if the cards were stacked against anyone, they were certainly stacked against Elizabeth.